The baby's cries pierced through the howling wind like a prayer torn from desperate lips. Thomas Crowfeather pressed the infant closer to his chest, his weathered hands trembling not from the bitter Montana cold, but from the weight of losing everything in one terrible night. The storm had been merciless, but not as merciless as his own people's judgment. Lightning split the sky as he stumbled toward the small cabin nestled in the valley below. Its windows glowed like amber eyes in the darkness, promising warmth he no longer believed he deserved. His wife, Sarah, had died giving birth to their daughter just 3 days ago, and the tribal council had branded him Waziku, an outsider, for marrying a white woman. Now he wandered the wilderness with nothing but his infant daughter and the crushing weight of exile. The baby's wails grew weaker, and panic seized his heart. Little Emma needed warmth, food, shelter, things he could no longer provide. His own wounds from the beating he'd received were still fresh, painting his buckskin shirt with streaks of dried blood. But his daughter's life mattered more than his pride. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw her, a woman with auburn hair braided down her back, stirring something over a wood stove. She moved with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to solitude, her simple dress the color of prairie grass. When she turned toward the window, her green eyes met his through the glass, and time seemed to pause between heartbeats. Clara Whitmore had been watching the storm from her kitchen when the shadow appeared outside her window. Living alone on the frontier had taught her to be cautious, but the sight of a man clutching a crying baby to his chest shattered every barrier she'd built around her heart. She'd lost her own child 2 years ago, and the sound of an infant's cry still haunted her dreams. Without hesitation, she threw open her door. Rain lashed against her face as she saw him clearly, a Lakota man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair plastered to his head and eyes that held the kind of pain she recognized in her own mirror. But it was the baby that drew her forward, her maternal instincts overriding every other thought. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "My daughter, she needs help." Clara didn't hesitate. She'd heard the stories about the violence on the reservation, seen the aftermath of broken treaties and broken families. This man was no threat. He was a father desperate to save his child. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Both of you." As Thomas crossed her threshold, carrying his daughter into the warmth and light, neither of them realized they were stepping into something far more profound than shelter from the storm. They were walking into a love story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about belonging, redemption, and the courage it takes to build a family from the ashes of loss. The baby's cry softened as the warmth embraced her, and Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope, stirring in her chest like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter's last snow. Clara's hands worked with practiced efficiency. Warming goat's milk over the fire while Thomas sat rigid in the wooden chair, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too deeply of the kindness that surrounded him. The cabin was modest but clean, filled with the scent of lavender and fresh bread. It felt like a sanctuary he didn't deserve. "What's her name?" Clara asked softly, testing the milk's temperature on her wrist. "Emma," Thomas replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Emma Crowfeather." The baby had quieted in the warmth, her tiny fists uncurling from their desperate grip. Clara approached slowly, her movements gentle and deliberate. When she lifted Emma from Thomas's arms, he flinched, expecting her to recoil from his touch, from the blood on his shirt, from everything he represented. Instead, Clara cradled the infant with the natural grace of someone who had once been a mother. "Hello, little one," she whispered, and Emma's dark eyes focused on her face with surprising alertness. "You're safe now." Thomas watched in wonder as Clara fed his daughter, her green eyes soft with a tenderness that made his chest ache. No one had shown him such compassion in months. Since Sarah's death, He'd been treated like a ghost haunting the edges of two worlds, never fully belonging to either. "You're hurt," Clara observed, noticing the cuts on his face and the way he held his left arm. "It's nothing," Thomas said quickly, but Clara's sharp look told him she wasn't fooled. "I was a teacher before I came here," she said, settling Emma in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets. "I've seen my share of injuries. That cut on your forehead needs tending." Thomas wanted to refuse, to maintain what little dignity he had left, but exhaustion weighed on him like stones. When Clara returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloth, he didn't resist. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned his wounds, her fingers steady and sure. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering the rage in the council's faces, the stones that had driven him from the only home he'd known. "I fell in love with the wrong woman," he said. "According to my people, I betrayed everything sacred by marrying Sarah. When she died, they said it was punishment for my choices." Clara's hand stilled on his forehead. "And you believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," Thomas admitted. "I only know that my daughter deserves better than a father who brings shame to her name." Clara sat back on her heels, studying his face. "I lost my husband and baby boy to fever 2 years ago," she said. "People in town told me it was God's will, that I should accept it and move on. But grief doesn't follow anyone else's timeline, and neither does healing." Thomas opened his eyes, seeing her clearly for the first time. The shadows under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and the careful way she held herself suggested someone who had learned to carry pain with grace. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. Clara glanced at Emma, who had fallen asleep in her makeshift cradle. "Because sometimes the very thing that breaks us open is what allows the light to get in," she said. "You're not broken, Thomas Crowfeather. You're just a man who loved deeply and lost greatly. That's not shame, that's courage." As thunder rumbled in the distance, Thomas felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this strange white woman with gentle hands and a wounded heart might be the key to finding his way back to the light. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Thomas knew he should leave. Clara had been nothing but kind, but he couldn't burden her with his presence indefinitely. He'd watched her with Emma, seen the way her face lit up when the baby smiled, and it both warmed and worried him. They were all walking on borrowed time. "You don't have to go," Clara said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. She was mending one of Emma's tiny gowns by the window, her needle catching the afternoon light. Thomas looked up from where he was carving a small wooden bird, a gift he'd planned to leave behind. "I can't stay forever." "Why not?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and complex all at once. "Because I'm Lakota, and you're white, and Emma ... double quotes." He set down his carving. "She'll never belong anywhere if she stays with me." Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. "She belongs with her father. Her father is an outcast." Thomas's voice carried the weight of months of rejection. "The reservation won't take me back, and the white settlements won't accept a half-breed child." "Where does that leave her?" "It leaves her here," Clara said firmly, "with people who love her." The word hung between them like a bridge neither had meant to build. Thomas felt his heart stop, then resume beating with painful intensity. "Clara ... I know what you're going to say," she interrupted, setting down her mending. "You're going to tell me it's impossible, that people will talk, that we're from different worlds. But I've been alone in this cabin for 2 years and 3 days. You and Emma have brought more life into this place than I've felt since my family died." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The valley stretched before them, green and vast, unmarked by the boundaries that seemed to govern everything else in their world. "You don't understand what you're asking. If word gets out that you're harboring a Lakota man..." "Let them talk," Clara said, rising to join him at the window. I'm tired of living my life according to other people's fears. Emma stirred in her cradle, making soft cooing sounds that drew both their attention. Clara moved to pick her up, and Thomas watched as his daughter instinctively curled into the woman's embrace. The sight hit him like a physical blow, not with pain, but with recognition. This was what family looked like. This was what home felt like. "She trusts you," he said quietly. "And I love her," Clara replied without hesitation. "I love her as if she were my own." Thomas turned to face her fully, seeing the truth written in her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe we're not as different as we think. Maybe two broken people can build something whole together." Clara's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the vulnerability beneath her courage. "I'm saying that if you'll have me, I want to be Emma's mother. And if you'll let me, I want to be more than that." The words Thomas had been holding back for days finally found their voice. "Clara, I think I'm falling in love with you." She smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through clouds. "I think I fell in love with you the moment you trusted me with your daughter." As if sensing the momentous nature of the conversation, Emma gurgled happily in Clara's arms, her tiny hand reaching up to touch the woman's face. Thomas stepped closer, close enough to smell the lavender in Clara's hair, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more sure of anything," Clara replied. And when Thomas reached out to cup her face in his hands, she leaned into his touch like she'd been waiting for it her whole life. The rider appeared at sunset, his horse's hooves thundering across the meadow like a harbinger of the conflict Thomas had been dreading. Sheriff William Barnes dismounted with the rigid posture of a man who'd rather be anywhere else, his badge catching the dying light as he approached the cabin. Thomas was chopping wood when he spotted the lawman, and instinctively moved to place himself between the house and the potential threat. Through the window, he could see Clara holding Emma, her face pale but resolute. "Thomas Crowfeather," Barnes called out, his hand resting on his gun belt. "I need to have a word with you." "What about?" Thomas set down his axe, but kept his hands visible, a lesson learned from too many dangerous encounters with white authority. "Got reports you've been seen in the area. People are nervous." Barnes glanced toward the cabin, where Clara had appeared in the doorway. "Miss Whitmore, you all right in there?" "I'm fine, Sheriff," Clara replied, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "Is there a problem?" Barnes shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, some folks in town are concerned about your situation here. Having an Indian on your property, especially one with a reputation for violence." Thomas felt his jaw clench. "What reputation?" "You know what reputation," Barnes said. "The fight with the tribal council, the threats made against white settlers. People think you might be dangerous." "The only danger here is to my daughter if she doesn't have a warm place to sleep," Thomas replied evenly. "Miss Whitmore has been kind enough to offer a shelter." Clara stepped forward, Emma still in her arms. "Sheriff Barnes, Thomas and his daughter are my guests. They're welcome here for as long as they choose to stay." Barnes removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Miss Whitmore, I'm sure you mean well, but you don't understand the situation. This man was cast out by his own people for good reason. Having him here puts you at risk." "Risk of what?" Clara's voice carried a steel Thomas hadn't heard before. "Risk of having help with the farm work? Risk of having someone to talk to during the long winter nights? Risk of watching a beautiful baby grow up healthy and happy? Risk of being associated with someone who doesn't belong in decent society," Barnes said bluntly. "Ma'am, I'm trying to protect you." Thomas stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. "Sheriff, I've done nothing wrong. I've broken no laws. I'm simply trying to care for my daughter." "Your daughter who's half white," Barnes pointed out. "What kind of life can you give her, living between two worlds that don't want either of you?" The question struck Thomas like a physical blow because it echoed his own deepest fears. But before he could respond, Clara's voice cut through the tension. "The same kind of life any parent tries to give their child," she said firmly. "One filled with love, security, and hope for the future. Thomas is an honorable man, and Emma is an innocent baby. If society has a problem with that, then society needs to change." Barnes looked between them, his expression troubled. "Miss Whitmore, I've known you since you came to this valley. You're a good woman, but you're playing with fire here." "Sheriff," Clara said, her voice softening slightly, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a child. I'm a grown woman capable of making my own decisions. And my decision is to offer friendship and shelter to a man and his daughter who needed help." Thomas watched the exchange with growing amazement. Clara was defending him, not just politely, but with genuine conviction. She was choosing to align herself with him despite the social consequences, despite the easier path of sending him away. Barnes replaced his hat with a sigh. "I can't force you to send them away," he said. "But I can't protect you from the consequences of your choices, either." "I'm not asking you to," Clara replied. "I'm asking you to judge Thomas by his actions, not by other people's prejudices." As the sheriff rode away, Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside him. Clara had just publicly claimed him as worthy of her protection, her respect, her friendship. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he might truly belong somewhere. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber as Clara Thomas to make her grandmother's bread recipe. His large hands worked the dough with surprising gentleness, the same care he showed when handling Emma. Clara found herself stealing glances at his profile, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he concentrated. "Like this?" Thomas asked, kneading the dough with steady rhythm. "Perfect," Clara said, her voice slightly breathless. Their hands brushed as she adjusted his technique, and the simple contact sent warmth shooting up her arm. "You're a quick learner." "I had to be," Thomas replied, his voice carrying undertones of old pain. "After Sarah died, I realized I knew nothing about caring for a baby. I've been learning everything as I go." Clara's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his admission. "You're doing beautifully with Emma. She adores you. She deserves better than a father who's making it up as he goes along." "Thomas," Clara set down her flour-dusted hands and turned to face him fully. "Every parent is making it up as they go along. The difference is that you're doing it with love." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara felt something electric pass between them. They were standing close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Clara," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I'm not the man I was before Sarah died. The grief, the anger, the way my people turned on me, it changed me. I'm not sure I know how to be the kind of man you deserve." Clara stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I don't want you to be anyone other than who you are right now. The man who carved toys for his daughter with his own hands. The man who chops my firewood without being asked. The man who tells Emma stories in Lakota so she'll know where she comes from." Thomas's hands stilled on the dough. "You've been listening." "Every word," Clara admitted. "I love hearing you speak your language. It's beautiful. Would you ... Thomas hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. "Would you like me to teach you some words?" Clara's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "I'd love that." Thomas wiped his hands on the dish towel, then gently took Clara's hands in his. "Medaku Oyasik," he said slowly. "It means all my relations. In Lakota culture, it reminds us that we're connected to everything and everyone around us." Clara repeated the phrase carefully, her pronunciation clumsy but earnest. "Medaku Oyasik." "Good." Thomas smiled, the first truly relaxed smile she'd seen from him. "And this," he said, bringing her hand to his heart, "is Hanta heart." "Hanta," Clara whispered, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. The intimacy of the moment overwhelmed her, and she found herself leaning closer, drawn by forces she couldn't name. "Clara," Thomas breathed, his free hand coming up to cup her face. "I think I'm falling in love with you." "I think I already have," she replied, her voice barely audible. When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who had thought he'd lost the capacity for gentleness. Clara melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she kissed him back with months of loneliness and longing finally finding their voice. They were interrupted by Emma's cheerful babbling from her cradle, and they broke apart, both breathing hard. Thomas rested his forehead against Clara's, his eyes closed. "This is dangerous," he said quietly. "I know," Clara replied, but she made no move to step away. "I don't care. People will talk. They'll say things about you that you don't deserve to hear. Let them." Clara's voice was fierce with determination. "I'm tired of living my life according to other people's rules." Thomas pulled back to look at her, seeing the strength and conviction in her green eyes. "You're sure about this? About us?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Clara said, and when she kissed him again, it felt like a promise, one that would bind them together against whatever storms might come. The general store fell silent when Clara walked in with Emma strapped to her chest in a sling Thomas had woven from soft leather. Every eye in the place turned to stare at the white woman carrying an obviously Native American baby, and Clara felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. "Morning, Clara," said Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, her voice carefully neutral. "That's quite an interesting baby carrier you have there." "Thomas made it," Clara replied, lifting her chin with pride. "He's very skilled with his hands." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Henderson's smile became strained. "Yes, I'm sure he is. ... How long will your guests be staying?" "They're not guests anymore," Clara said calmly, selecting flour from the shelf. "They're family." The gasp that went around the store was audible. Emma chose that moment to gurgle happily, her tiny hand reaching up to touch Clara's face, and the simple gesture of affection seemed to scandalize the onlookers even more. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false concern, "surely you don't mean to. That is, people are talking, and it's not good for a young woman like yourself to be associated with ... Well, with his kind." Clara's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You mean the kind that works from dawn to dusk, repairing my barn without being asked? The kind that sits up all night with a crying baby so I can sleep? The kind that carved me a new kitchen chair when he noticed mine was broken?" "That's not what I meant, and you know it," Mrs. Henderson said, her cheeks flushing red. "I meant the kind that was cast out by his own people for violence. The kind that brings trouble wherever he goes." Clara set down her basket with deliberate care. "Mrs. Henderson, Thomas Crowfeather has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. He's a good man and a devoted father. If you have specific accusations to make, I suggest you make them to Sheriff Barnes. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you keep your opinions to yourself." "Well, I never," Mrs. Henderson huffed, but Clara had already moved to the counter to pay for her purchases. As she left the store, Clara could hear the whispers starting before the door even closed behind her. She walked with her head high, Emma contentedly dozing against her chest, but inside, her heart was racing with the implications of what had just happened. The ride home felt longer than usual, and Clara found herself jumping at every sound, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was out here alone with the baby. By the time she reached the cabin, her nerves were stretched thin. Thomas was waiting for her in the yard, his expression grim. "How did it go?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "About as well as expected," Clara said, allowing him to help her down from the wagon. "Mrs. Henderson made it clear that our ... arrangement is the talk of the town." Thomas's jaw tightened. What did she say? Nothing I haven't heard before in various forms, Clara replied, though she couldn't quite meet his eyes. Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He stilled, his hands falling away from the wagon. What is it? The accusations about violence. Is there any truth to them? Thomas was quiet for so long that Clara's heart began to sink. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. There was a fight, he said. After Sarah died, some of the younger men on the reservation said things about her, about Emma, about me. They said I had dishonored our people by marrying a white woman. I lost my temper. And I fought back. I heard someone badly enough that they had to bring in the tribal police. Thomas looked at her then, his eyes pleading for understanding. I'm not proud of it, Clara, but they were threatening my daughter, saying she didn't belong anywhere. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. You were protecting Emma. I was protecting my family, Thomas said simply. And if I had to do it again, I would. Clara stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face. Then we understand each other perfectly. You're not afraid of me? I'm afraid of a world that would make a man feel like he has to apologize for loving his daughter, Clara said fiercely. But I'm not afraid of you, Thomas. I never could be. When he kissed her then, it was with the desperation of a man who had expected to lose everything and found grace instead. And Clara kissed him back with the fierce determination of a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. The first snow of winter dusted the valley like a blessing, transforming the landscape into something pristine and new. Thomas stood at the window, watching Clara play with Emma in the yard, both of them laughing as they caught snowflakes on their tongues. The sound of their joy filled the spaces in his heart that had been empty for so long. 6 months had passed since the storm that brought him to Clara's door, and in that time they had built something he hadn't dared hope for a real family. Emma had taken her first steps between them just last week, tottering from Thomas's arms to Clara's with squeals of delight that had brought tears to both their eyes. But winter was coming, and with it, the harsh realities of their situation. The town's disapproval had only grown stronger as their relationship became more obvious. The sheriff had stopped by twice more, always with concerns about Thomas's presence, and Clara had received several letters from distant relatives expressing their shock and urging her to come to her senses. Thomas fingered the small wooden box in his pocket, feeling the weight of the ring inside. He'd carved it himself from a piece of oak, inlaying it with small turquoise stones he'd traded for in town. It wasn't much by white standards, but it represented everything he had to offer: his skill, his devotion, his promise to protect and cherish. She's getting so big, Clara said, coming inside with Emma bundled in her arms. The baby's cheeks were pink with cold, her dark eyes bright with happiness. She looks like her mother, Thomas said, taking Emma and settling her near the fire. Strong and beautiful. Clara blushed, hanging up her cloak. I was thinking we should start teaching her to read soon. She's so curious about everything. She should know both languages, Thomas said, English and Lakota. She has a right to both parts of her heritage. Of course, Clara agreed, settling beside him on the wooden bench he'd built for the fireside. I want her to know where she comes from. Thomas looked at the two most important people in his world, his daughter gurgling contentedly by the fire, and the woman who had saved them both. The words he'd been practicing seemed to stick in his throat. Clara, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, I need to ask you something. She looked at him with those green eyes that had become his anchor, his hope, his home. What is it? Thomas reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small box. I know this isn't how things are usually done in your world. I know I should ask your father's permission, should have more to offer than a small cabin and a man with a complicated past. Clara's breath caught as understanding dawned in her eyes. Thomas ... But I love you, he continued, pulling out the box with trembling hands. I love you more than I ever thought possible. You saved my daughter's life, and you saved mine. You gave us hope when we had none, and you've made us a family." He opened the box, revealing the simple wooden ring with its turquoise inlay. "Clara Whitmore, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she looked at the ring, so different from anything she might have expected, but perfect in its simplicity and meaning. "Thomas, it's beautiful. I know it's not much," he said, suddenly uncertain. "I know you could probably find someone more suitable, someone who wouldn't bring complications to your life, ... "Stop," Clara said, pressing her fingers to his lips. "Just stop. Yes, Thomas. Yes, I will marry you." The relief on his face was so profound it nearly broke her heart. With shaking hands, he slipped the ring onto her finger, and Clara marveled at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been meant for her all along. "There's something else," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to adopt Emma legally. I want her to have your name too, if you'll have us." Clara's answer was lost in the kiss she pressed to his lips, but when they broke apart, she was smiling through her tears. "Emma Clara Crow Feather Whitmore," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." As if she knew she was being discussed, Emma pulled herself up on wobbly legs and tottered over to them, her arms outstretched. Thomas lifted her up, and she settled happily between them, her small hands patting both their faces as if blessing their union. "We're going to be a real family," Clara whispered, and Thomas felt the last of his doubts melt away like snow in the spring sun. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost painting intricate patterns on the cabin windows. Clara stood before her small mirror, adjusting the simple white dress she'd sewn herself, her hands trembling with nerves and excitement. The wooden ring on her finger caught the light, and she smiled, thinking of Thomas's face when he'd proposed. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Sheriff Barnes standing on her porch, his expression grave. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to speak with you about today's proceedings." Clara's heart sank. "What about them?" "There's been talk in town. Some of the more vocal residents have expressed concerns about the legality of your marriage to Thomas. They've petitioned the territorial judge to block it." "On what grounds?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "Miscegenation laws," Barnes said uncomfortably. "Some territories have specific statutes about marriage between whites and Indians. They're claiming it's not legal." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "And is it? Legal, I mean?" Barnes shifted his weight. "That's the thing. Montana Territory doesn't actually have such laws on the books. The petition has no legal standing. But that doesn't mean people won't try to cause trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that could get dangerous if you're not careful," Barnes said seriously. "Miss Whitmore, I've known you for years, and I respect your choices. But I'm also responsible for keeping the peace in this county. If you're determined to go through with this, I need to know you understand the risks." Clara straightened her shoulders. "Sheriff, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Thomas and I are getting married today, with or without the town's approval." Barnes nodded slowly. "Then I'll be there to make sure it happens peacefully. You'll need witnesses. Do you have anyone?" Clara's heart sank further. In all her planning, she'd forgotten about witnesses. Most of the town disapproved of their relationship, and she had no family nearby. We hadn't thought about that." "I'll stand as witness," Barnes said, surprising her. "And I'll bring my deputy. That should make it official." "Why?" Clara asked, tears pricking her eyes. "Why would you do that when you've expressed your own concerns?" Barnes settled his hat back on his head. "Because I've watched Thomas these past months, and I've seen what kind of man he is. He's worked hard, caused no trouble, and clearly loves you and that baby. Sometimes the law and what's right aren't the same thing, but this time they are." An hour later, Clara stood in the small wooden church at the edge of town, her hand clasped in Thomas's. He looked handsome in his simple black suit, his long hair braided with leather and silver ornaments that had belonged to his father. Emma sat quietly in the front pew, wearing a tiny dress Clara had sewn from scraps of her wedding gown. The preacher, an elderly man named Father Mackenzie, had agreed to perform the ceremony despite the controversy. "Love is a gift from God," he told them simply. "I won't turn away two people who want to pledge their lives to each other." The church was nearly empty, just Sheriff Barnes, his deputy, and a few of Clara's more progressive neighbors. But as Thomas spoke his vows, his voice strong and clear, Clara felt as if the whole world was bearing witness to their love. "I promise to love you, protect you, and honor you for all the days of my life," Thomas said, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "I promise to be a good husband to you and a good father to our daughter. I promise to build a life with you that's worthy of the love you've shown us." Clara's voice was steady despite her tears. "I promise to love you and Emma with all my heart. I promise to stand by you through whatever comes, to build a home where love is stronger than prejudice, where our daughter can grow up proud of who she is." When Father Mackenzie pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Clara with such tenderness that even the sheriff had to clear his throat and look away. Emma clapped her hands from the front pew, her happy gurgling the only sound in the quiet church. As they walked out into the crisp morning air, hand in hand, Clara felt the weight of the town's stairs, but also the strength of Thomas's love beside her. They were married now, bound together by law and love, and no amount of disapproval could change that. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Crowfeather?" Thomas asked, lifting Emma into his arms. "I've been ready my whole life," Clara replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and filling the valley with wildflowers and new possibilities. Clara stood in her garden, one hand on her growing belly, watching Thomas teach Emma to plant seeds in the rich earth. At 18 months old, their daughter was chattering in a mixture of English and Lakota, her dark curls bouncing as she toddled between the furrows. "Mama," Emma called, holding up a handful of dirt with pride. "Look." "I see, sweetheart," Clara laughed, walking over to kiss the top of her head. "You're such a good helper." Thomas stood, brushing soil from his hands, and placed them gently on Clara's rounded stomach. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Clara said, leaning into his touch. "The sickness is finally passing." They discovered Clara was expecting just after the new year, and the joy of it had sustained them through the hardest winter either had ever faced. The town's hostility had intensified after their marriage, with some businesses refusing to serve them and former friends crossing the street to avoid Clara's presence. But their love had only grown stronger in the face of adversity. "Thomas," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of excitement, "I have news." He looked at her with concern. "What kind of news?" "Sheriff Barnes stopped by while you were checking the cattle. He said there's been a change in the territorial government. The new governor is more sympathetic to our situation." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means there's talk of establishing a school district that would include our property. Emma could go to school with other children, learn alongside them instead of being isolated." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting on her belly. "And you think they'd accept her?" "I think times are changing," Clara said hopefully. "Slowly, but changing nonetheless." Sheriff Barnes also mentioned that there's a Lakota delegation coming to negotiate new treaties with the territorial government. They're looking for interpreters. Thomas's eyes widened. They want someone who speaks both languages fluently. Someone who understands both cultures, Clara added. Someone who could help bridge the gap between two worlds. The possibility hung between them like a bridge to a future they'd hardly dared imagine. Thomas had always been gifted with languages, and his experiences in both worlds had given him unique insights into the tensions that plagued the territory. "It would mean traveling," Thomas said slowly. "Being away from you and Emma for weeks at a time." It would mean making a difference, Clara countered. It would mean using your gifts to help prevent the kind of violence that drove us together in the first place. Emma chose that moment to run to them, her small arms wrapping around both their legs. "Mama! Papa! Look where I found!" She held up a small blue flower, its petals perfect and pristine. Clara knelt down, ignoring the protest from her growing belly, and examined the treasure seriously. "It's beautiful, Emma. What do you think we should do with it?" "Give me the baby," Emma said solemnly, patting Clara's stomach. "For brother." Clara and Thomas exchanged amused glances. They'd been careful not to mention the baby's gender, but Emma seemed convinced she was getting a brother. "That's very thoughtful," Thomas said, lifting Emma into his arms. "But we don't know if the baby is a boy or a girl yet." "Brother," Emma said with the certainty of a child. "His name is Sam." Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "Sam? Where did you get that name?" "Dream," Emma said simply, then wiggled to be put down so she could return to her planting. Thomas and Clara watched their daughter with wonder. She was growing up between two worlds, but unlike her father, she seemed to navigate both with ease. She spoke Lakota with the natural fluency of a child, but she also charmed the few townspeople who were willing to interact with her bright smile and innocent chatter. "She's going to be extraordinary," Clara said softly. "She already is," Thomas replied, "just like her mother." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the valley in shades of gold and green, Clara felt a peace she'd never experienced before. The hostility of the town still hurt, but it couldn't touch the sanctuary they'd built together. Their love had created something stronger than prejudice, something that would endure long after the narrow-minded had been forgotten. "I love you, Thomas Crow Feather," she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "I love you too, Clara Crow Feather," he replied, and the name still sent thrills through her heart. 5 years had passed since the storm that changed everything, and Clara stood in the same spot where she'd first seen Thomas through her window, now watching their son Samuel play with his sister Emma in the yard. At 6 years old, Emma was teaching 3-year-old Sam to weave grass into small baskets. Her patient instruction delivered in the mixture of languages that had become their family's natural way of communicating. "Careful with the stems, Sam," Emma said, her dark eyes serious with concentration. "Papa says we must respect what the earth gives us." Sam nodded solemnly, his chubby fingers working to mimic his sister's movements. He had Clara's green eyes and Thomas's strong jaw, and like Emma, he seemed to belong fully to both worlds that had created him. Thomas approached from the barn, his hair now streaked with silver at the temples, his face weathered but content. The years had been good to him, bringing not just happiness, but respect in the community. His work as a cultural interpreter had earned him recognition from both the territorial government and several tribal councils. And slowly, the town's hostility had given way to grudging acceptance. "How did the meeting go?" Clara asked, settling into his embrace with the ease of long practice. "Better than expected," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. The new school board approved Emma's enrollment for the fall term. She'd be the first Native American child in the district, but she won't be the last. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Really? Really?" "Times are changing, Clara. Not as fast as we'd like, but changing nonetheless." Emma looked up from her weaving, her face bright with excitement. "I'm going to school with other children?" "If you want to," Thomas said, kneeling down to her level. "You'll learn reading and writing and arithmetic. But you'll also keep learning Lakota from me and the old stories from your grandmother's people." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I want to learn everything." "That's my girl," Thomas said, lifting her into his arms. "Knowledge is power, and power shared is power multiplied." Clara watched her husband with their daughter, marveling at how completely their lives had transformed. The bitter, broken man who had stumbled to her door in the storm had become a bridge between worlds, a healer of old wounds, a father who was raising children to see possibility instead of barriers. "There's something else," Thomas said, setting Emma down but keeping his eyes on Clara. "I've been offered a position with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They want me to help establish schools on the reservations, places where children can learn both cultures without having to choose between them." Clara's heart leaped with excitement and fear. "That's wonderful, Thomas. But what would it mean for us?" "It would mean moving closer to the reservation, being part of a larger community. It would mean our children growing up with other children like them." Thomas took her hands in his. "It would mean going home." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Home? For so long. Home had been this cabin, this valley, this sanctuary they'd built together. But Clara understood what Thomas meant. Home wasn't just a place, it was belonging, community, the chance to be part of something larger than themselves. "The reservation would accept us?" Clara asked. "Accept me?" "They would accept my family," Thomas said firmly. "You're my wife, the mother of my children. That makes you family too." Sam abandoned his weaving project and toddled over to them, his small arms reaching up to be held. Clara lifted him, feeling the solid weight of his small body against her chest, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. "What do you think, little man?" she asked him. "Should we go on a new adventure?" "Venture," Sam repeated enthusiastically, clapping his hands. Emma was more thoughtful. "Will there be other children like us there?" "Yes," Thomas said. "Children who speak 2 languages, who know 2 ways of seeing the world. Children who are bridges between old and new." Clara looked around at the valley that had sheltered them, at the cabin where they'd built their love, at the garden where they'd planted their hopes. It would be hard to leave, but she understood now that their real home wasn't this place. It was each other. "When would we go?" she asked. "Spring," Thomas said. "When the traveling is easier and the children can start fresh in a new place." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara felt the rightness of the decision settle in her heart. They had come so far from that stormy night when a desperate man had appeared at her door with a baby in his arms. They had built a love that had withstood prejudice, fear, and the weight of 2 worlds that seemed determined to keep them apart. But love, Clara had learned, was stronger than any barrier. Love was the bridge that spanned every divide, the light that illuminated every darkness, the hope that sustained every dream. "I love you, Thomas Crowfeather," she said, the words carrying the weight of 5 years of joy and struggle, of children born and dreams realized, of a future that stretched before them bright with possibility. "I love you too, Clara Crowfeather," he replied, and in his voice she heard the echo of that first night when he had spoken her name like a prayer. Emma and Sam played at their feet, their laughter mingling with the evening breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and new beginnings. They were a family now, complete and whole, bound together by love that had transformed them all. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but its gift remained, a love that had given them all hope. A family that proved that belonging wasn't about where you came from, but about who you chose to become together. And in the growing darkness of the Montana evening, as stars began to appear in the vast sky above them, Clara knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. In the spring of 1881, the Crowfeather family moved to the newly established reservation community, where Thomas became the first Native American administrator of the integrated school system. Emma grew up to become a teacher and advocate for Native American rights, while Sam followed in his father's footsteps as a cultural interpreter and peacemaker. Their love story became legend in the valley, a testament to the power of love to overcome even the deepest divisions. Clara and Thomas lived to see their grandchildren grow up in a world where love between people of different cultures was no longer revolutionary, but simply human. They had planted seeds of hope that grew into forests of possibility, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single act of courage, like opening your door to a stranger in a storm.